Hi, I'm Federico Ruggeri, and today I'm going to talk about our work entitled On the Definition of Prescriptive Annotation Guidelines for Language Agnostic Subjectivity Detection. This work was done in collaboration with the colleagues from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering and those from the Department of Interpreting and Translation, both from the University of Bologna. Our work focuses on subjectivity, which according to Fang is a feature of language. In particular, when making an utterance, the speaker simultaneously expresses their position, their attitude and feelings towards the utterance, thus leaving their own mark. We tackled the problem of identification of subjectivity in contextual documents, which formally translates to the task of subjectivity detection, which is about distinguishing subjective content from objective one. Subjectivity detection has been widely explored in the literature. In particular, we can distinguish between two macro categories of approaches. The first one is about syntactic approaches, where in particular the annotation of the detection of subjectivity is based on keyword spottings or by leveraging language-specific lexicons. So the main drawback of these approaches is that they rely on language-specific features which cannot transfer well to other languages unless some kind of lossy translation processes are considered. And the macro category is the so-called semantic approaches, including statistical techniques and also deep learning and neural approaches. In this case, these solutions imply the existence of a labeled training corpora, usually built by relying on task or domain-specific assumptions. For instance, subjective content may be attributed to a particular source of documents, or by designing annotation guidelines for the purpose. This last aspect about annotation guidelines is where we build our work. In particular, we observe that semantic approaches are independent from language-specific lexicons, thus having the potential to collect larger corpora that also target multiple languages, thus allowing to explore and better study the properties of subjectivity. However, as observed by Chaturvedi and colleagues in their study, there's a major challenge when collecting and annotating content for subjectivity detection. That is, the perception of subjectivity is subjective itself. So it is very hard to define practical, non-language specific and also largely applicable annotation guidelines for subjectivity detection. In this work, we go into this direction to propose a solution for these major challenges and frame in particular subjectivity detection for a specific task in order to downplay potential annotation biases and thus collect data with high agreement and high quality. In particular, we follow the prescriptive annotation paradigm and propose a methodology that follows this paradigm for developing task-oriented annotation guidelines. And to validate our methodology, we discuss and introduce a case study on fact-checking and elaborate on encountered open challenges. We follow the prescriptive paradigm in order to design our methodology for collecting annotation labels in the context of subjectivity detection. In particular, our methodology comprises three major steps. The first one is schematic guidelines. Here we have to define the notion of subjectivity in accordance to the objectives of a particular task of interest in order to frame subjectivity and thus downplaying potential annotation biases. As a result, we have to define schematic guidelines that are based on specific real cases concerning the task of interest, and the property of having schematic guidelines is beneficial for two main aspects. The first one is that it's less sensitive to domain or language-specific cues, thus allowing transferability to other languages, and also eases the annotator's training process. The second step of our methodology is the iterative refinement. The idea is that in the first step we have designed a preliminary set of schematic annotation guidelines. Here we have to refine the annotation guidelines based on the data that concerns our tasks. In particular, we frame this refinement process as a collective iterative process, with the primary objective of identifying and resolve edge cases, that is, instances with high disagreement, and to do so, we design multiple annotation pilot studies since edge case discovery is an iterative process. and the set of pilot studies is iterated until a sufficient agreement is reached. This type of approach is aligned with the prescriptive paradigm, since I-annotator disagreement is a call to action to address potential unresolved annotation instances. The third and last step of our methodology is the reliable annotation concerning the real data collection process. The first step concerns the annotator's training phase with the set of validated guidelines derived from the second step of our methodology. As a first recommendation, we consider multiple annotators per instance to downplay potential annotators' biases, like interpretation bias. And one primary objective for annotators is to identify potential edge cases. If an edge case is identified, then a discussion phase is considered in order to address and reach a common agreement on the instances with high disagreement. If such disagreement cannot be solved, then an additional annotator is considered in order to solve and propose a majority label for that particular instance. We also consider the possibility of discarding low-quality annotators labels if an annotator particularly disagrees with the other set of annotators in order to address noisy labels in the data. And lastly, another recommendation for collecting the dataset is to report per instance agreement as a measure of quality assurance in order to identify high quality samples and edge cases or noisy labels in the dataset. So having presented our methodology, we now propose and discuss a case study on fact-checking in order to validate our presented methodology. In particular, as a domain, we consider English and Italian news articles targeting ongoing controversial topics like political affairs, civil rights, and economics. And the task is discriminating between subjective and objective sentences in news articles. Thus, our input granularity is at sentence level, which is in line with the current trend or the standard approach in fact-checking. And this is an important task that we study, since the detection and processing of subjective content as the final purpose of creating an objective narrative upon which fact-checking relies. So we believe that subjective content may contain several information, in particular also objective information that may be relevant in order to a fact-checking pipeline. So the first step is to identify the set of factual content in each document, either as objective or via a preliminary processing phase from subjective content, in order to then apply the fact-checking pipeline to verify if factual information is true or should be confuted. In particular, we follow our methodology, and as a first step, we propose an initial set of annotation guidelines, so the first step of our methodology. And in particular, we consider 6 annotators with near-native knowledge of English and Italian languages, and propose as an iterative refinement process to refine our preliminary set of guidelines, 2 pilot studies for the validation of the guidelines. And experimentally, we observed that the interannotator agreement increases between the pilot studies from 0.39 to 0.53, thus showing that the iterative refinement of the guidelines and also the discussion of edge cases allows to reach a common agreement on several instances, and thus allowing to collect more high quality data. And we also observed that following the same set of annotation guidelines for both languages, we observed similar or identical edge cases. So the 2 languages share common dynamics from this point of view. And in particular, between considering the 2 languages, we consider 2 important aspects of during the annotation. First of all is the importance of contextual information. So we discuss whether to annotate using context information or not. And also several edge cases were encountered during these 2 pilot studies. And we here discuss our solutions in order to reach a common agreement between the annotations. The first point of discussion concerns the usage of contextual information for the annotation process. This is a particular important aspect since the annotations that we carry out is at the sentence level, and thus there may be cases in where contextual information may be beneficial for the annotation. For this purpose, we arrange annotators in two groups. The first groups can annotate news article sentences in order of appearance and can thus leverage contextual information, whereas the second group annotates sentences in random order and cannot leverage contextual information. We observe interagreement of 0.38 for group 1 and 0.53 for group 2, denoting that an annotation without context is better or more beneficial compared to our expectations. For this reason, we opt for a contextless annotation, also considering two important aspects. First of all, using context leads to a higher annotator's workload, and also context information may be not available in some domains like in tweets. The second aspect that we discuss are the edge cases that we encountered in our case study. We identify 4 edge cases, in particular emotions, quotes, intensifiers, and speculations, and provide an example in this table. Regarding emotions, according to the literature, emotions usually convey a subjective point of view, and thus we should be more inclined to annotate emotion carry statements as subjective. However, in the context of subjectivity detection framed for the task of fact-checking, emotion carry statements cannot be verified, since the emotions are based on the author's belief and sensations only. And in particular, feeling an emotion is a fact that only for the person sensing it. Thus, this kind of information should not be of interest for a fact-checking pipeline. And for this reason, we agree on annotating emotions as objective. The second edge case that we discussed and encountered are quotation marks. In particular, quoted content may be subjective, that is, the author may cite or refer to other individuals' opinions, but the purpose of our task concerning subjectivity detection only concerns the author point of view. Thus, we are only interested in the opinions of the article. For these reasons, we denote quotes as objective. The third edge case concerns intensifiers. That is, their presence could be symptomatic of author's personal point of view, and thus, for these reasons, we identify intensifiers as potential subjectivity indicators. And lastly, we talk about speculations. In many cases, it's particularly difficult to judge implicit statements from the author without leveraging our own interpretation bias. And in many cases, also, authors make use of speculation to allude to their own interpretation of events. For these reasons, we identify speculation as a device of subjective content, and as statements involving speculations are denoted and labeled as subjective. Concluding, we have presented our work on developing annotation guidelines for task-oriented subjectivity detection. In particular, we introduced a methodology for collecting high-quality data that is based on prescriptive paradigm and provides a task-specific definition of subjectivity. To support and validate our methodology, we have described an application of a preliminary case study concerning fact-checking in 2 languages, English and Italian. And we discussed and proposed a solution for encountering edge cases and particular aspects of the annotations, like the usage of contextual information.